Manhattan was silent from the insulated bubble of Dorian Caldwell's penthouse. The sprawling city stretched out beneath him, alive with lights and movement, but his world was as lifeless as the walls that enclosed him. His home, a masterpiece of glass and steel, was meticulously designed, yet utterly devoid of warmth. Every surface gleamed coldly, untouched by personal history. Dorian stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the skyline as the final days of December played out like a countdown in his mind. It wasn't the calendar he watched, but the clock in his chest, ticking toward New Year's Eve, when he planned to bring his life to an end. To him, the choice was practical, the only solution to a hollow existence. He had everything society said should bring fulfillment: wealth that opened any door, recognition as a powerful figure in the real estate industry, and possessions that screamed success. Yet, the emptiness gnawed at him, relentless and all-consuming. No amount of work, travel, or possessions could silence the echoes of regret and loneliness in his soul. Pulling a sleek coat over his shoulders, he left the penthouse. Outside, winter gripped the city in its icy hands. The streets of Manhattan were a blend of extravagance and desperation, but Dorian barely registered the contrast. He walked with no destination, his polished shoes clicking against the frosted pavement. He turned down an unfamiliar street, where the buildings grew older and the neon signs dimmer. The world seemed quieter here, the hum of the city giving way to a muffled stillness. Just as his thoughts began to spiral deeper into despair, a burst of laughter broke through the silence. It wasn't the laughter of adults. It was children, high-pitched and unrestrained. It caught him off guard, the sound incongruous with the surrounding desolation. Following the sound, he rounded a corner and saw a building he hadn't noticed before. Its facade was weathered, the sign above the door reading, New Horizons Community Center. Through the frosted window, he glimpsed children gathered in a modest room, their faces illuminated by strings of colorful lights. A woman stood among them, her presence commanding yet kind. She was laughing with them, holding their attention like a lighthouse cutting through the fog. Dorian lingered in the shadows, his breath visible in the cold air. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, an ember of curiosity. But just as quickly, he turned away, brushing it off. Whatever warmth he'd glimpsed wasn't meant for someone like him. Still, the laughter followed him as he walked away, refusing to let him forget. Dorian stood outside the community center, the laughter still echoing in his ears. The building looked tired, peeling paint, flickering lights over the doorway, but from within came a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He took a cautious step closer, his curiosity warring with the ever-present weight of detachment. Through the window, he spotted a woman kneeling beside a small group of children seated in a semicircle. Her dark curls framed a face lit with a kind of lightness that felt utterly foreign to him. She was animated, her hands gesturing as she read from a well-worn book. The children's eyes were wide, their smiles contagious. In the middle of the group sat a girl no older than 6, her hair in 2 messy pigtails. She leaned forward eagerly, clutching a teddy bear as though it were listening too. Dorian's gaze lingered on her innocent expression, a sharp contrast to the world outside the center's walls. The woman closed the book, her voice softer now as she encouraged the children to discuss what they'd learned. They answered eagerly, some stumbling over words, but beaming with pride nonetheless. Dorian couldn't hear the details, but the scene struck him as unexpectedly profound. A sudden noise startled him. A boy, barely out of his toddler years, had dropped a cup of juice. The liquid spilled across the worn carpet, spreading quickly. The children gasped, but the woman didn't flinch. "It's all right, Oliver," she said gently, fetching a cloth from a nearby table. She handed it to the boy, guiding him to help clean up. "Mistakes happen. What matters is how we fix them." Dorian felt a lump form in his throat. Her words carried a weight he didn't expect. He stepped back, intending to leave, when the door opened suddenly. "Sir?" A teenage volunteer called out. "Were you here to see the center?" She held out a flyer. "We're raising funds to keep it open. Every bit helps." Caught off guard, Dorian took the flyer automatically. The paper was smudged and creased, listing donation options and upcoming events. Before he could respond, the teenager smiled and disappeared back inside. The warmth of the center's interior spilled into the cold night as the door closed. Dorian glanced at the flyer in his hand, his brow furrowed. Without a word, he tucked it into his pocket and walked away, the sound of children's laughter lingering long after he left. The community center was Serafina Moore's second home, though it often felt like her first. Her mornings began before sunrise, preparing breakfast for Aloan in their cramped apartment above a bakery. The scent of bread baking in the early hours was comforting, a quiet reminder of stability, even if only a fragile one. "Don't forget Teddy," Serafina reminded her niece, watching the little girl dart between the couch and a stack of books, searching for her favorite stuffed bear. "I've got him," Aloan exclaimed, holding the worn toy aloft like a trophy. Serafina smiled, brushing her curls from her face as she buttoned Aloan's coat. By the time they arrived at the community center, the building was already alive with chatter. Volunteers prepared supplies, and children trickled in with excited greetings. Serafina felt a surge of pride, though it was tinged with anxiety. The center wasn't just a safe haven for the kids. It was her lifeline too. Her sister's passing had left a gaping hole, and raising Aloan on her own had been an overwhelming responsibility. The center became her anchor, a place where she could pour her energy and grief into something meaningful. "Morning, Miss Moore," a volunteer called, breaking her thoughts. She returned the greeting, masking her exhaustion with a bright smile. There wasn't time to dwell on personal struggles. The kids needed her focus, and the center needed her strength. In the quiet hours before the children arrived, Serafina reviewed a stack of overdue bills. Repairs to the heating system, rent on the property, and the ever-mounting costs of art supplies and snacks loomed over her like a storm cloud. Her optimism was the glue holding the place together, but even she felt it cracking under the weight. Her heart sank when she saw the notice tucked among the papers. Arthur Kane, a prominent developer, had officially filed to purchase the property. Kane had been circling like a vulture for months, determined to level the center and replace it with another high-rise. "Just think about it, Miss Moore," Kane had said during his last visit, his tone dripping with faux concern. "A payout like this could give you and the kids something better." Something better? Serafina knew what his version of better meant: displacement and cold indifference. She clenched the paper in her hand. As long as she had breath in her body, she wouldn't let that happen. A knock on the office door pulled her from her thoughts. Aloan peeked inside, clutching Teddy. "Miss Sarah, the kids are ready for story time," she announced. Serafina forced a smile, hiding the storm within. "Let's not keep them waiting." She followed Aloan back to the group, her determination renewed. Kane might be relentless, but so was she. The flyer had remained in Dorian's pocket for days, its creased edges a constant reminder of a world he hadn't expected to care about. On a rare whim, he found himself outside the community center again, this time in broad daylight. The building seemed even smaller and shabbier in the harsh light, but the laughter of children spilled out with the same unfiltered joy he'd heard before. Dorian hesitated before stepping inside. The warmth hit him first, not just the heat from the struggling radiators, but the energy of the place. It was a chaotic symphony of voices, clattering chairs, and squeals of excitement. Serafina noticed him almost immediately. She stood at the edge of a craft table, guiding a child's hand as they painted a wobbly star. Her gaze flicked to the well-dressed stranger lingering in the doorway. "Can I help you?" she asked, wiping her hands on a paint-smeared apron. Her voice was polite, but edged with curiosity. Dorian cleared his throat, uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "I came to help," he said, holding up the crumpled flyer like it was a peace offering. Serafina raised an eyebrow. "Help?" She stepped closer, folding her arms. "How exactly?" "Financially," he replied, his tone brisk. "I can make a donation, enough to cover your immediate costs." For a moment, her expression softened, but it quickly shifted into something guarded. "That's generous," she said, tilting her head. "But money only goes so far. These kids don't just need supplies. They need someone who shows up for them." Dorian stiffened, and used to being challenged. "I thought you'd be eager to accept help in any form," he replied, his voice cooler. Serafina smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've learned to be cautious about people who think they can fix everything with a check. If you really want to help, spend some time here. Get to know the kids." See what we're about. Dorian hesitated, her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. He looked around the room, the vibrant chaos of children drawing, laughing, and building towers with blocks. Something in their innocence stirred an unease in him he couldn't place. I'll consider it, he said finally, his tone measured. Good, Serafina replied, her smile softening into something genuine, because that's what they really need. As she turned back to the children, Dorian lingered, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, someone had looked beyond his wealth and demanded something more. It was unsettling and strangely compelling. The late afternoon sun streamed through the community center's smudged windows, casting golden light over scattered supplies and boxes of donations. Aloan sat cross-legged on the floor, rummaging through one such box with Teddy propped on her lap. Her small hands sifted through old books, faded clothes, and a few odds and ends. Miss Sarah, look. Aloan's excited voice broke through the din of the center's activities. She held up a photograph, its edges yellowed with age. Serafina set down the stack of worksheets she was sorting and crossed the room. What is it, sweetheart? Serafina knelt beside her, taking the photograph. It showed a woman standing in front of the center's entrance, decades ago. The sign above the door was freshly painted, and the woman wore a wide, hopeful smile. Dorian walked into the room at that moment, uncharacteristically casual in a dark sweater. He froze when Aloan, ever eager, held the photograph up toward him. Do you know her? The little girl asked, her wide eyes curious. Dorian's face paled. He stepped closer, taking the photograph with trembling hands. It was his mother. He recognized the curve of her smile, the way she stood with quiet confidence. But what shocked him most was the background, the center he stood in now. My mother, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Serafina looked at him, her brow furrowed. Your mother? He nodded, his voice thick. She must have been involved here. I didn't know. A sudden weight settled in Dorian's chest. The woman who had raised him, whose death had marked the beginning of his descent into isolation, had been part of something he never knew existed. She had stood here, in this very space, surrounded by hope and purpose. You didn't know she helped with the center? Serafina's tone was gentle but curious. No, he admitted, his gaze fixed on the photograph. She never mentioned it. Or maybe I wasn't listening. Silence hung between them. For the first time, Serafina saw the cracks in Dorian's composed exterior, his grief, regret, and something else she couldn't quite place. Aloan's small voice broke the quiet. Maybe she wanted to make people happy, like you could. Dorian flinched, as if struck by the simplicity of her words. He handed the photograph to Serafina, his fingers lingering on its edge. I need to think, he muttered, retreating to the door. Serafina watched him leave, clutching the photograph. For a man who seemed so distant, the weight of his connection to this place was undeniable. The next time Dorian stepped into the community center, the air felt different. Maybe it was the heaviness he still carried after discovering his mother's connection to the place. Or perhaps it was the faint hope that being here might finally answer some of the questions he had buried for years. Either way, he had made a decision, to stay, at least for now. Serafina met him at the entrance, a clipboard in hand, and her usual air of efficiency tempered by curiosity. You're back, she said, tilting her head. Dorian nodded stiffly. I thought about what you said. I'll help with my time, he added, his voice uncertain, as though the words were foreign. Her surprise softened into a smile, not triumphant but welcoming. All right then, let's see what you can do. Within an hour, Dorian found himself at a table surrounded by children working on art projects. A boy with untidy hair held up a paintbrush, dripping blue onto the table. Mr. Caldwell, what's your favorite color? Dorian hesitated, caught off guard by the simple question. Green, I suppose. The boy grinned and promptly added a streak of green to his painting. It's the best color now. The interaction was small, but it cracked something open in Dorian. For the first time in years, his presence seemed to matter to someone. Across the room, Serafina observed him as she worked with Aloan on her reading. She noticed how stiff he was at first, but the children's natural curiosity gradually drew him out. A fleeting thought crossed her mind. Maybe he wasn't as unreachable as he seemed. The peace of the moment was interrupted when Arthur Kane strode into the center, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the colorful chaos around him. His mere presence sent a ripple of unease through the staff and volunteers. "Miss Moore," Kane called, his voice clipped. "A word." Serafina rose, her back straight, and met him near the doorway. "What is it this time, Mr. Kane?" He handed her an official-looking document. "The property auction is scheduled. You have until the end of the month to vacate." Serafina's heart sank, but she refused to let it show. "We're not going anywhere," she replied firmly. Kane smirked. "Suit yourself. But sentiment doesn't pay the bills, Miss Moore." With that, he turned and left. Dorian, who had been close enough to overhear, watched Serafina fold the document with trembling hands. He stepped toward her, uncharacteristically hesitant. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. Her eyes met his, a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "We fight," she said. "Together." For the first time, Dorian nodded without hesitation. Dorian sat cross-legged on the floor of the community center, his tailored trousers a poor match for the sticky mess of art supplies scattered around him. A giggling Aloan handed him a glue stick and some mismatched sequins. "Mr. Caldwell," she said with a hint of authority, "you're not doing it right. The glitter goes first, then the sequins." He raised an eyebrow, glancing at the chaotic pile of crafts on her side of the table. "And yet, your masterpiece has glue in places I didn't know glue could reach." Aloan dissolved into laughter, her peals of delight so genuine that even Dorian couldn't suppress a small, reluctant smile. A boy nearby, intent on finishing his own project, chimed in, "Why don't you just listen to Aloan? She's always bossy, but she's usually right." "Usually," Dorian repeated, his tone dry but playful. Moments like these were becoming strangely frequent. Though he still felt out of place, Dorian found himself leaning into the easy rhythm of the children's world. Their chatter and unapologetic joy chipped away at his carefully constructed armor. When the children dispersed for snack time, Serafina appeared at his side. "You're better at this than you think," she said, a teasing smile tugging at her lips. Dorian brushed glitter from his sleeve with a feigned grimace. "If that's a compliment, it's the oddest one I've received." She laughed, and the sound stirred something in him. "I was going to make coffee," she said. "Care to join me?" They retreated to the modest kitchenette, where the hum of the children in the next room provided a comforting backdrop. Serafina busied herself pouring the coffee, while Dorian leaned against the counter, watching her. "You're good at this," he said, his voice quieter now. "Making coffee?" she asked, glancing at him with mock seriousness. He smirked. "No, all of this. The kids, the center. It's like you were made for it." Her expression softened, but a hint of sadness crept into her smile. "It's not always easy," she admitted, setting 2 mugs on the counter. "But it gives me purpose. And after losing my sister, I needed that." Dorian nodded, understanding more than he expected. "I lost someone too. My mother. I didn't realize how much she cared about this place until recently." Serafina's eyes searched his face, her usual determination replaced by empathy. "Maybe that's why you're here now," she said gently. "To reconnect with her in some way." He didn't answer right away, instead staring into his coffee as if it held answers. "Maybe," he said finally. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding of shared grief. "You know," she said after a moment, "you're not the person I expected when you walked in here the first time." "And what did you expect?" he asked, half smiling. She shrugged. "Someone cold, detached, someone who wouldn't care." "And now?" "Now," she said, meeting his gaze, "I think you're someone who wants to care but doesn't know how yet." The vulnerability in her words left him unsteady, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he found himself grateful for her honesty, even if it unsettled him. Before the conversation could continue, the sound of Aloan calling for Miss Sarab broke the moment. Serafina smiled apologetically, grabbing her mug. "Duty calls," she said, pausing at the door. "But you're welcome here, Dorian. Don't forget that." As she left, Dorian stayed in the quiet of the kitchen, her words resonating in a way he couldn't quite explain. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged somewhere, even if only in the smallest way. The headline in the local paper hit Serafina like a gut punch. "Community Center in Disarray. Mismanagement alleged as developer steps in." A grainy photo of her taken outside the center accompanied the article, her tired expression frozen in an unflattering glare. She gripped the newspaper, her hands trembling. Around her, the usually vibrant energy of the center felt muted. The children were oblivious, laughing as they played a game of tag, but the volunteers exchanged worried glances. "Miss Sarah?" Eloan tugged at her sleeve, her small voice breaking the heavy silence. Serafina forced a smile, crouching to meet her niece's wide, innocent eyes. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Go on and play." As Eloan skipped away, Dorian approached from across the room, holding his own copy of the newspaper. His jaw was tight, and his normally composed demeanor betrayed an edge of frustration. "He's targeting you," Dorian said bluntly, holding up the article. "Of course he is," Serafina replied, her voice flat. "Kane wants people to believe I'm incapable of running this place, so he can swoop in and play the hero." Dorian's eyes darkened. "The timing is deliberate. He wants to destabilize you right before the auction." "I know," she said, sitting heavily on a nearby chair. "But knowing doesn't make it any easier." Dorian hesitated, watching her. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, the weight of the accusations clearly taking its toll. For a brief moment, he felt a surge of protectiveness, but it was quickly swallowed by doubt. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked. "I could have helped manage this before it got out of hand." Serafina's head snapped up, her exhaustion replaced by a flash of anger. "Because this isn't a business deal, Dorian," she said sharply. "These are real people, real lives. You can't just manage your way out of it." Her words struck a nerve. He stiffened, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. She wasn't wrong, but the implication stung. That he was still the cold, detached businessman who saw everything in terms of strategy. "I'm trying to help," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know you are," she replied, softening. "But this isn't something you can fix overnight. And it's not just about money or damage control. It's about trust." Her words lingered in the air as Dorian looked away, his own doubts creeping in. Could he really be the person these people needed? Or was his involvement only making things worse? That night, as the center emptied, Dorian stayed behind. He sat alone in the dimly lit main room, the distant hum of the city filtering through the walls. He thought about the children, Serafina, and the weight of what they were up against. He thought about his mother. Would she have seen him as someone capable of carrying her legacy? Or would she have been disappointed in the man he'd become? The creak of the door broke his thoughts. Serafina stepped inside, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold. "You're still here," she said softly, sitting down across from him. "I've been thinking," he admitted. "Maybe Kane is right. Maybe someone like me doesn't belong here." Her brow furrowed, and she leaned forward. "Don't let him get in your head, Dorian. That's exactly what he wants." He shook his head. "It's not just him. It's me. I've spent my whole life building walls, keeping everything and everyone at a distance. Even now, I'm not sure I know how to help without reverting to what I know best. Control." Serafina placed a hand on the table between them, her fingers just inches from his. "You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. And you don't have to do this alone." He met her gaze, searching for the belief she seemed to have in him. It felt fragile, like a rope fraying under the strain of doubt, but it was there. "I just don't want to fail," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't," she replied simply, her tone steady. "Keep showing up, even when it's hard. That's what matters most." For the first time, Dorian felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't in years: hope. It wasn't enough to silence his doubts entirely, but it was a start. As they sat in the quiet of the center, Serafina's presence grounded him in a way he couldn't yet explain. Maybe she was right. Maybe showing up was the first step toward something better. The children's laughter filled the community center, but it was laced with an undercurrent of curiosity. That morning, they had arrived to find the usually modest art room transformed. New paints, brushes, sketch pads, and even easels lined the tables, along with bins of brightly colored clay and markers. Eloan gasped as she spotted a set of glittery stickers in the shape of stars and moons. "Miss Sarah, look!" she exclaimed, holding them up like treasure. Serafina stood near the doorway, her arms crossed but her expression soft. She knew exactly who was behind the surprise. Dorian entered moments later, his face carefully neutral as the children flocked to him, questions pouring out. Where did all this come from? One of them asked. Did you bring it? Another piped up, looking at him with wide eyes. He raised his hands, unsure how to handle their excited energy. I thought you could use some new supplies, he said simply, his voice steady but quieter than usual. The children cheered, and before he could retreat, Aloan ran up to him with a crayon-sketched thank you card. This is for you, she said, beaming. Dorian accepted the card, staring at the crooked letters and uneven hearts. Something shifted inside him, a crack in the icy walls he had spent years building. Serafina approached, smiling. You didn't have to do this, you know. I wanted to, he replied, his tone earnest. They deserve better. The warmth in her expression lingered, but there was also a flicker of concern. You're doing good here, Dorian. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Her words seemed to hang in the air longer than either of them intended, but the peace didn't last. Later that evening, as Dorian helped stack chairs in the quieting center, his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. Mr. Caldwell, the voice on the other end drawled. It was Arthur Kane. What do you want? Dorian asked, his tone instantly defensive. Kane chuckled. You've been busy, haven't you? Playing the hero for a struggling community center. Touching, really. Get to the point. Well, let's just say your past doesn't quite match the image you're projecting now, Kane replied. Old scandals have a way of resurfacing, and I'd hate for your newfound friends to see a headline they won't forget. Dorian's grip on the phone tightened. What do you want, Kane? I want this center. Walk away, or I make sure every skeleton in your closet dances its way into the public eye. Kane hung up before Dorian could respond. He stared at the phone, his pulse pounding. Serafina appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed. Is everything all right? For a moment, Dorian considered brushing her off, retreating into the safety of silence. But then he saw the worry in her eyes, the trust she had so cautiously begun to extend to him. No, he admitted, his voice low. Kane's trying to dig up my past to discredit me, and the center. Serafina's expression darkened. Let him try. We have nothing to hide. I do, Dorian said, his tone grim. And if he brings it to light, it could hurt more than just me. Then we face it, she said firmly, stepping closer. You're not the only one with a past, Dorian. But you're here now, and you're doing something good. That's what matters. Her words offered some comfort, but Dorian's mind raced. He had worked so hard to bury his mistakes, but Kane's threat had brought them to the surface like ghosts. The next day, Dorian returned to the center with a renewed determination. The children's enthusiasm over the new supplies gave him a reason to keep going, even as Kane's threat loomed in the back of his mind. Mr. Caldwell, look at my painting, one of the boys called, holding up a vivid picture of a dragon soaring over a castle. That's impressive, Dorian said, kneeling to get a closer look. Did you come up with that on your own? The boy nodded proudly. Miss Sarah says I have a good imagination. You do? Dorian agreed, a genuine smile tugging at his lips. Nearby, Serafina watched the scene unfold. She could see the strain in Dorian's posture, the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking. But she also saw the way he softened around the children, how he listened to their stories as if they were the most important thing in the world. When the day ended, she approached him as he gathered his coat. You did something amazing for them today, she said. He hesitated, meeting her gaze. It's not enough. It is, she insisted. These kids don't care about your past or your mistakes. They care about the person standing in front of them right now. Her words struck him deeply, but he didn't have a chance to respond before Aloan ran up to hug him goodbye. Thanks for the glitter stickers, Mr. Caldwell. As he walked home that evening, Dorian replayed Serafina's words in his mind. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, for the first time, he could start making amends. The first snowfall of the season blanketed the city in a quiet, fragile beauty. Serafina stood outside the community center, her breath visible in the cold air. Aloan played nearby, catching snowflakes on her tongue, her giggles momentarily breaking through the weight of Serafina's thoughts. Inside, the center was warm but tense. Volunteers bustled about, trying to prepare for another day of activities. But the looming property auction hung over them like a dark cloud. Serafina knew time was slipping away. As she sorted through another box of old documents and donations in the back office, she came across a weathered leather journal. The name Eleanor Caldwell was written in elegant script on the inside cover. Serafina froze, her heart skipping a beat. Eleanor Caldwell. She remembered Dorian's quiet admission that his mother had been involved in the center's early days. Could this journal hold answers to the questions swirling around him and her? She opened the journal carefully, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Eleanor's words painted a vivid picture of her dedication to the center's founding. This place isn't just a building. It's a refuge, a second chance for so many who have nowhere else to go. If I can make even the smallest difference, it will all be worth it. Serafina's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. Entries detailed Eleanor's efforts to secure funding, her dreams for the children, and even notes about the struggles she faced balancing her philanthropic work with raising Dorian. One passage caught Serafina's attention. Dorian doesn't understand why I spend so much time here. I wish he could see the joy these children bring me, the hope they inspire. One day, I hope he'll see this place as I do. Tears stung Serafina's eyes. Eleanor's words were raw and full of love, a side of Dorian she hadn't fully understood until now. Later that day, Dorian arrived at the center. The snow dusted his dark coat as he stepped inside, shaking off the cold. Serafina was waiting for him, the journal clutched in her hands. "Dorian," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I found this." He looked at the journal, recognition and disbelief flickering across his face. "My mother's," he said, his voice trailing off. "She wrote about this place," Serafina continued, "about how much it meant to her, and how much she wanted you to understand why." Dorian took the journal carefully, his hands unsteady. He opened it to the passage Serafina had marked and read silently. His expression softened, the usual guardedness giving way to something vulnerable. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I didn't know how much this place mattered to her. I thought she was wasting her time." "She didn't think so," Serafina said gently. "She believed in what this place could do. And I think, deep down, she believed you'd carry that forward." Dorian looked at her, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent my whole life running from the past. And now, it's all here, staring me in the face." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. One of the volunteers poked their head in, holding a printed flyer. "Miss Moore, you need to see this." Serafina took the flyer, her jaw tightening as she read it. It was from Arthur Kane, announcing the official date of the property auction. The bold text at the bottom stung. "One way or another, this space will soon have a new purpose." She handed the flyer to Dorian, her expression grim. "He's not giving us much time." Dorian read it and clenched his jaw. "He's trying to pressure us into folding. Make us think we don't have a chance." "He's already swayed public opinion with those articles," Serafina said, her frustration evident. "And now this. It's like he's trying to break us from every angle." Dorian stared at the flyer for a moment, then at the journal in his hands. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "This place isn't just a building. It's a refuge." "No," he said firmly. "We're not giving up. Not yet." Serafina met his determined gaze. For the first time, she saw a side of him that mirrored Eleanor's passion. A man willing to fight for something greater than himself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in silence. But inside the center, a new resolve began to take shape. The fight wasn't over yet. The community center buzzed with quiet excitement as preparations for a Christmas celebration got underway. Strings of twinkling lights draped the windows, and volunteers carefully arranged handmade ornaments on the small tree in the main room. Serafina and Dorian worked side by side near the fireplace, hanging garlands while children decorated cookies at a nearby table. Dorian adjusted a sprig of holly on the mantel, stepping back to appraise his work. "I don't think I've done this since I was a kid," he admitted. Serafina glanced at him, her eyes warm. "You're surprisingly good at it." "Who knew?" He chuckled softly, his gaze drifting to the children's table. "I remember my mother trying to get me to help her decorate for Christmas. I always made excuses. I thought it was a waste of time." "She didn't think so," Serafina said gently, echoing the sentiment from Eleanor's journal. Dorian nodded, his expression growing pensive. "I didn't understand it back then. But now, seeing how much this place meant to her, how much it means to these kids. I wish I could tell her I get it now. You're telling her by being here, Serafina replied, her voice steady but kind. Every time you show up, every time you help, it's a way of honoring her. He turned to look at her, her words cutting through the doubts he hadn't yet voiced. You really believe that? I do, she said firmly. We all make mistakes, Dorian. What matters is what we do next. Second chances don't erase the past, but they can change the future. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Dorian felt a warmth he hadn't expected, a strange sense of being seen in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. Thank you, he said quietly. Serafina smiled, but before she could respond, one of the volunteers approached, her expression grim. Miss Moore, we've got a problem. What is it? Serafina asked, concern flickering across her face. The volunteer handed her a tablet, displaying an article on a local news site. The headline read, Donor funds misused at community center, sources claim. Dorian stepped closer, reading over her shoulder. The article accused the center of mismanagement, suggesting that funds meant for children's programs were being squandered on personal expenses. This is Cain, Dorian said, his voice cold with anger. Serafina's hands trembled as she set the tablet down. We've never done anything like this, she said, her voice cracking. But if people believe it, Cain doesn't care if it's true, Dorian replied. He just wants to undermine you and scare off your supporters. A wave of frustration washed over Serafina. We're already struggling to keep the lights on. If the donors pull out, Dorian placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. We'll figure this out, he said, his tone firm. He's trying to intimidate you, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with. Serafina looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know how much more of this I can take. You're stronger than you think, Dorian said, his voice softening. And you're not alone in this. We'll fight him together. The moment lingered between them, unspoken emotions surfacing in the quiet. For the first time, Serafina allowed herself to lean on someone else, the weight of her burden momentarily shared. I hope you're right, she whispered. I am, Dorian said, a flicker of confidence returning to his voice. As the evening wore on, they continued decorating in silence, the bond between them growing stronger with each shared glance and quiet word. Despite Cain's efforts to tear the center apart, hope lingered in the air like the soft glow of the Christmas lights, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found. The following Saturday, the community center buzzed with activity as families gathered for a hastily organized meeting. Despite the gray skies outside, the room was filled with vibrant energy, a shared sense of purpose uniting everyone present. Dorian stood near the back of the room, watching Serafina address the crowd. She spoke with her characteristic passion, her voice carrying over the murmurs of agreement and support. This center has been a haven for so many, she said, her eyes scanning the room. For the children, for families, for anyone who needed a place to feel safe and cared for. And now, it's under threat. But we won't let it go without a fight. Cheers erupted, the crowd clapping and voicing their agreement. Dorian felt an unfamiliar tug of pride as he saw the strength Serafina inspired in others. When she stepped aside, one of the parents took the floor. A tall man with a booming voice, he shared how the center had helped his son overcome a speech delay with the help of Serafina's reading programs. She doesn't just care about the kids, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. She cares about us too. About this whole community. The crowd erupted into applause again, and more families came forward to share their stories. A mother recounted how the center had provided meals when her family was struggling, while a teenager credited the after-school program with helping her stay on track in school. Finally, Dorian stepped forward. The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to him. I didn't grow up here, he began, his voice steady but quieter than Serafina's. And I never understood what it meant to have a place like this. Not until recently, he paused, glancing at Serafina before continuing. My mother was one of the founders of this center. She believed in what it could do. And now, being here, I see why. This isn't just a building. It's a lifeline, a chance for hope and second chances. And I promise, I'll do everything I can to make sure it stays that way. The applause was deafening. Dorian felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, a a sense of belonging and purpose he hadn't realized he was searching for. As the meeting wound down, Serafina approached him. "You didn't have to speak," she said, her tone soft. "I wanted to," he replied. "They deserve to know that I'm with them in this." Before she could respond, the center's office phone rang. One of the volunteers answered, then gestured for Serafina to take the call. "It's Kane," the volunteer whispered, her expression wary. Serafina hesitated but took the phone, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. Kane's voice was smooth and calculated. "Miss Moore, I trust you've seen the latest reports about your center." Unflattering, to say the least. Her grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want, Kane?" "A solution," he replied. "I'm offering you a chance to step away gracefully. Take the payout, and you'll have enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe even enough to support those children you care so much about." Serafina's jaw clenched. "You think money can solve everything, don't you?" "It usually does," Kane said smugly. "Be practical, Miss Moore. You're fighting a losing battle. The property auction is set. Your donors are pulling out. This is your chance to salvage something." She took a deep breath, her mind racing. The offer was tempting in its simplicity. No more battles, no more uphill climbs. But as she glanced through the office window at the children laughing with their families, she felt a renewed resolve. "This isn't just about money, Kane," she said firmly. "It's about a community, a legacy, something you wouldn't understand." "Don't be foolish," he warned, his tone hardening. "Think it over. You have until the auction to decide. After that, you'll get nothing." He hung up, leaving her staring at the receiver, her heart pounding. When she returned to the main room, Dorian was waiting for her. "What did he say?" he asked. "He offered me a bribe," she said, her voice tight. "Walk away and take the money, or lose everything." Dorian's expression darkened. "And what did you say?" "I told him no," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Dorian nodded, his respect for her growing. "Good. We'll fight this together, Serafina." "He won't win." She looked at him, the determination in his eyes bolstering her own. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in this battle. As the snow fell outside, the community center remained alive with hope and resilience. Together, they had formed a united front, ready to face whatever came next. The day of the auction arrived, its significance heavy in the air like the threatening clouds overhead. Dorian stood outside the municipal building where the proceedings would take place, his breath visible in the winter chill. Beside him, Serafina adjusted her scarf nervously, her usual composure faltering under the weight of what was at stake. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, glancing at Dorian. "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied, his tone steady. Inside, the room was filled with a mix of developers, local business owners, and a few curious onlookers. At the front of the room, Arthur Kane stood near the auctioneer's podium, exuding confidence. He caught sight of Dorian and Serafina as they entered, his smirk widening into a calculated grin. "Caldwell," Kane greeted, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Didn't expect to see you here. Finally embracing your competitive side." Dorian ignored him, guiding Serafina to a seat near the middle of the room. The air buzzed with murmurs as the auctioneer took his place, calling for order. "The property at 219 Ashland Avenue, currently housing the New Horizons Community Center, is now up for auction," the auctioneer announced. "Bidding will begin at $1 million. Kane wasted no time. 1.5, he called, his voice cutting through the crowd. Dorian raised a hand. 2 million. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Kane raised an eyebrow but quickly countered. 2.5. The bids climbed steadily, each round more tense than the last. Serafina gripped the edge of her seat, her pulse racing. 5 million, Dorian said calmly, drawing gasps from the crowd. Kane hesitated for the first time, his eyes narrowing. 6 million, he countered, his tone sharp. Before Dorian could respond, the auctioneer paused, addressing the bidders. "Gentlemen, before we continue, it's come to our attention that there are recent allegations concerning the misuse of funds tied to this property. Any further bids should take this into consideration." The murmurs turned into a low roar as the crowd exchanged glances. Kane leaned back in his chair, feigning innocence. Dorian stood, his presence commanding as he addressed the room. "Those allegations are baseless," he said firmly. And I have proof that they were orchestrated by none other than Arthur Kane. The room fell silent. Kane's confident demeanor faltered, his expression hardening. Dorian continued, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Inside this folder are documents tying Mr. Kane to multiple instances of bribery and fraud, including attempts to manipulate local officials to expedite this auction. He handed copies to the auctioneer and several key attendees. This center isn't just a property, Dorian said, his voice steady. It's a lifeline for children and families who have nowhere else to go. Kane's corruption threatens to destroy that for profit. The crowd erupted in whispers as the auctioneer reviewed the documents, his face grim. Kane rose from his seat, his tone defensive. This is a desperate attempt to discredit me, he snapped. Desperate? Dorian countered, his tone icy. You tried to use the same tactics on me, digging up my past, threatening to smear my name. But unlike you, I'm not here for profit. I'm here to save something worth fighting for. Kane's rebuttal was cut short when the auctioneer raised his hand. We will need to investigate these allegations further. For now, the auction will proceed, but these documents will be considered. Dorian met Serafina's wide eyes, her expression a mix of shock and gratitude. The auctioneer called for the next bid. Kane clenched his jaw. 7 million, he spat. Dorian hesitated. The number was staggering, far beyond what they had planned. But then he thought of the center, the children, and the legacy his mother had left behind. 9 million, Dorian called, his voice steady. Gasps filled the room. Even Kane seemed momentarily stunned. Going once, the auctioneer began. 10 million, Kane countered, his voice shaking with frustration. Serafina turned to Dorian, her voice low and urgent. Dorian, stop. This is too much. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. Dorian's jaw tightened as he stood again. 12 million. The room was silent. Kane stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. He didn't counter. Going once, the auctioneer repeated. Going twice. Sold to Mr. Caldwell for $12 million. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into applause. Dorian turned to Serafina, who looked at him with tears in her eyes. How? She whispered. Dorian exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. I sold the mansion, he said simply. Her eyes widened. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he interrupted gently. That place was just walls. This center, it's alive. It matters. Serafina's gratitude shone in her tearful smile as she hugged him tightly. Around them, the room buzzed with excitement, the community celebrating their victory. For Dorian, the weight he had carried for years began to lift. He had sacrificed more than money that day. He had let go of his past, embracing the present and the purpose it gave him. As they stepped outside into the snowy evening, the cold air felt lighter, filled with possibility. The center had been saved, but for Dorian, it was more than a victory. It was a new beginning. The room, once filled with whispers and murmurs, had descended into a heavy, stifling silence. Dorian sat rigid in his chair, the weight of the auction's last moments pressing down on him like a vice. The gavel had not yet fallen, but Arthur Kane's most recent bid, $15 million, hung in the air like a suffocating fog. The number was staggering. Dorian had pushed his resources to the absolute limit to reach his $12 million bid, sacrificing everything he had left. He had no answer to Kane's counter, and Kane knew it. Dorian glanced at Serafina, whose hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Her eyes brimmed with silent determination, but there was a flicker of fear in her expression, fear that their fight, their sacrifices, had all been in vain. The auctioneer looked around the room. 15 million, going once, he called, his voice calm but final. Dorian felt a crushing sense of defeat. His fingers clenched into fists as he stared at the polished surface of the table, his mind racing for a solution that didn't exist. Going twice, the auctioneer began. A voice rang out from the back of the room, clear and firm. 16 million. Gasps rippled through the audience as heads turned toward the source of the bid. A tall, elegantly dressed woman stepped forward, her gray hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She exuded confidence and grace, her piercing gaze fixed on the auctioneer. 16 million, she repeated. On behalf of Mr. Caldwell and the New Horizons Community Center, Kane's jaw dropped, his composure slipping for the first time. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. The woman ignored him, walking steadily toward the front of the room. She stopped beside Dorian, offering him a warm smile. "My name is Margaret Eastwood," she said, "and I owe your mother a great deal, Mr. Caldwell. She helped fund my first shelter years ago, back when no one else believed in me. I couldn't stand by and watch her legacy be destroyed." Dorian stared at her, stunned. "Mrs. Eastwood, She raised a hand, cutting him off gently. "You've done enough, young man. Your fight inspired me. Let's finish this together." Kane scrambled to recover, his voice rising. 17 million. Margaret's smile didn't waver. 18. The crowd erupted in whispers again, the tension in the room palpable. Kane's face darkened as he rose from his chair. 19 million. 20 million. Margaret replied without hesitation. The auctioneer's gaze darted between the two bidders. 20 million. Going once. Going twice. Kane slammed a hand on the table, his frustration boiling over. 21 million. Margaret tilted her head, her calm demeanor unshaken. 25 million. The room fell silent, the sheer audacity of the number leaving everyone breathless. Kane's face turned red, his fury barely contained. He looked around the room, as though searching for an ally, but found none. The auctioneer waited, his gavel poised. 25 million. Going once. Going twice. Kane slumped back into his chair, his face a mask of defeat. "Sold to Mrs. Eastwood on behalf of Mr. Caldwell in the New Horizons Community Center," the auctioneer declared, bringing the gavel down with a definitive thud. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Serafina clapped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Dorian exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his chest tight with relief and disbelief. Margaret turned to Dorian, her expression soft. "Your mother would be proud of you," she said simply. He swallowed hard, emotion thick in his throat. "Thank you. I don't even know how to repay you." "You already have," Margaret replied, her voice gentle, "by fighting for something that matters." As the crowd began to disperse, Serafina approached Dorian, her eyes red from tears but her smile radiant. Without a word, she threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved the center." "We saved it," Dorian corrected, his voice soft. Serafina pulled back, her hands still on his arms. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You already have," he said, echoing Margaret's words. "By believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Across the room, Kane stormed out, his defeat palpable. The sight was a quiet triumph for everyone present, a symbol of the power of community and determination. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the city in a fresh layer of white. Dorian and Serafina stepped out into the crisp air, joined by Margaret and several volunteers. "Now comes the hard part," Serafina said with a small laugh. "Rebuilding." Dorian smiled, a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time in years, he felt free from his past, from his doubts, and from the hollow life he'd once led. "Rebuilding," he said, "is the easy part when you've got something worth building." As they walked back toward the center, their footsteps crunching in the snow, the lights of the city seemed brighter, the future filled with promise. Against all odds, they had one. But more importantly, they had found hope, and for Dorian, a second chance to truly live. The weeks following the auction were a whirlwind of activity and transformation. The New Horizons Community Center was no longer just a battered building clinging to survival. It was the heart of a renewed community. Dorian stood outside the center, watching as construction crews worked to repair the weathered facade. The peeling paint had been stripped away, replaced with a fresh, welcoming coat of blue. Inside, walls were being reinforced, new flooring installed, and state-of-the-art heating systems added. It wasn't just about fixing the building. It was about honoring what it stood for. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered around a newsstand. Dorian couldn't help but glance at the headlines, which now read very differently than before. Local developer Arthur Kane faces corruption allegations after failed auction, and New Horizons Center saved by generous community efforts. Kane's fall from grace had been swift and merciless. Public support for the center had only grown as his deceit was exposed, leaving him disgraced and out of options. "Quite the improvement, isn't it?" Serafina's voice came from behind him, pulling his attention back to the center. He turned to see her standing nearby, a soft smile on her face. She held a steaming cup of coffee, which she offered to him. "It's starting to feel like a second home," he admitted, taking the cup, "though I think it already was for a lot of people." "For me too," she said, her gaze sweeping over the building. "And for Aloan. I finalized the paperwork this week. Her guardianship is officially mine." Dorian's smile widened. "That's incredible, Serafina. She's lucky to have you." "She's changed my life," Serafina said softly. "And in a way, so have you." The words hung in the air for a moment before she cleared her throat, gesturing toward the building. "Come on. You haven't seen what they've done to the new activity rooms." Inside, the changes were even more striking. The once cramped main room was now open and bright, with new furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. Artwork created by the children was framed and displayed proudly, a testament to the creativity the center had always nurtured. As they walked through the building, they passed Aloan, who was busy helping a volunteer arrange supplies in the new art room. She waved enthusiastically when she saw them, her pigtails bouncing as she ran over. "Miss Sarah, Mr. Caldwell," she exclaimed. "Did you see the new shelves? There's so much space for books now." "We did," Serafina said, crouching to her niece's level. "What do you think? Do you like it?" Aloan nodded vigorously. "It's perfect. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Dorian smiled, bending down to meet her gaze. "You don't have to thank me, Aloan. This place is for you and all the kids. Just promise you'll keep filling those shelves with amazing stories, okay?" "I promise," she said, beaming before running back to her task. As Dorian straightened, Serafina lingered beside him, her expression thoughtful. "You've really become part of this place," she said. He glanced at her, his tone light. "Are you saying I've earned my glitter and glue badge?" She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "More than that. You've earned something harder. Trust." They walked together into the newly refurbished kitchen, where the smell of fresh paint mingled with hints of cinnamon from a batch of cookies cooling on the counter. The room was quiet, offering a rare moment of peace amidst the activity. Serafina leaned against the counter, her hands cradling her coffee mug. "You've done so much for this place, Dorian, for all of us. I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "You already have," he replied, echoing Margaret Eastwood's words from the auction. "This place, it's not just about my mother's legacy anymore. It's become something more. Something I didn't even know I needed." Her eyes softened, a mix of gratitude and something deeper reflected in them. "You've changed, you know, since the first day you walked in here." Dorian chuckled. "I think I had to. Otherwise, I wouldn't have survived glitter duty." She smiled, shaking her head. But as the laughter faded, the weight of everything they had been through together hung between them. "You're different too," he said, his tone quieter, stronger. "Not just for Aloan or the center, but for yourself." She nodded slowly, the truth of his words sinking in. "I think we've both found something we didn't expect here." Their gazes held for a long moment, the unspoken feelings between them clear as day. Slowly, Dorian reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "I'm not sure where this journey is taking me," he admitted, his voice steady but vulnerable. "But I know I want you to be part of it." Serafina's lips curved into a soft smile as she tightened her hand around his. "I'd like that," she said simply. The moment was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter echoing down the hallway. They both turned, their smiles widening as they watched the kids dart past, their joy infectious. "Looks like the center's ready for its next chapter," Dorian said. "And so are we," Serafina replied. As the day drew to a close, they joined the others in putting the final touches on the center's decorations. The lights twinkled like stars, the laughter of children filled the air, and the promise of a brighter future lingered in every corner of the space they had fought so hard to protect. For Dorian and Serafina, it wasn't just the start of a new chapter for the center, it was the start of something new for them as well. Together, they were ready to build something even stronger than walls, a community, a family, and a future filled with hope. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air as Christmas music played softly in the background. The New Horizons Community Center was alive with warmth and joy, its rooms glowing with soft lights and decorations made by the children. Families gathered around tables laden with homemade treats, their laughter and chatter blending into a symphony of celebration. Dorian stood near the entrance, quietly observing the scene. The renovations were complete, and the center felt transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a sanctuary, a beating heart for the community. He watched as Serafina moved through the crowd, greeting families and offering cookies to the children. Aloan trailed after her, wearing a red dress and a grin that lit up the room. "Mr. Caldwell," Aloan's voice cut through his thoughts as she ran toward him, holding a plate of gingerbread cookies. "Try one. I made these with Miss Sarah." Dorian crouched to her level, accepting a cookie with mock seriousness. "You made these?" he asked. She nodded eagerly. "Miss Sarah said I'm a natural baker." Taking a bite, he smiled. "Delicious. I think you might have a future in this." Aloan giggled and darted back to Serafina, leaving Dorian with a rare sense of peace. As the evening unfolded, Dorian found himself drawn deeper into the celebration. He helped string lights around the main room, joined a group of kids in building gingerbread houses, and even found himself laughing at their silly jokes. The laughter didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like home. Later, as the crowd began to settle, Serafina approached him, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. She handed him one and nodded toward the fireplace, where several children sat on the floor, listening to a volunteer read a Christmas story. "This is what it's all about," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the children. "A place where they feel safe, where they can just be kids." Dorian nodded, his voice equally quiet. "You've built something incredible here, Serafina." "We've built it," she corrected, meeting his eyes. Their gazes held for a moment, the connection between them undeniable. "Dorian," Aloan called, bounding over with something in her hands. "I made this for you." She held up a small ornament, made from clay and painted in bright, uneven colors. On it, in her wobbly handwriting, were the words, "Family isn't born, it's built." Dorian stared at the ornament, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "It's true, you know," Aloan said matter-of-factly. "You're part of our family now." He knelt, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Aloan. This means more to me than you know." She hugged him tightly before running off again, leaving Dorian holding the ornament like it was the most precious thing in the world. Serafina stepped closer, her voice soft. "She's right, you know. You've become part of something bigger here." Dorian looked at her, his eyes reflecting a newfound clarity. "For the first time, I feel like I belong somewhere. Like I've found my place." Serafina smiled, reaching out to touch his arm. "You have, Dorian, and we're glad you're here." The night ended with a group photo in front of the Christmas tree, the children laughing and jostling for space as the adults tried to corral them into place. Dorian stood next to Serafina and Aloan, his hand resting lightly on Aloan's shoulder. When the camera flashed, he realized he was smiling, a real, unguarded smile. As the guests began to leave, Dorian lingered with Serafina and Aloan. Snow fell gently outside, blanketing the world in a soft, shimmering white. "Thank you," Dorian said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "for letting me be part of this, part of your lives." "You didn't need permission, Dorian," Serafina replied, her tone warm. "You earned it." As they stepped outside into the snow, Aloan tugged on his hand. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing to the glowing windows of the center. "It looks like a Christmas card." Dorian smiled, the image forever etched in his mind. The center, lit from within, surrounded by snow and laughter. It was a symbol of hope, of unity, and of the power of second chances. For the first time in years, he felt whole. And as he walked with Serafina and Aloan into the snowy night, the ornament tucked safely in his pocket, he knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they had built something unbreakable, a family reimagined, and a future filled with possibility.